Week 9 of the 2024 fantasy football season is here. We've got a full day of NFL games. We got a nice Monday night matchup, so you know exactly what we're going to do. We're going to break down 10 things that you need to know before you set your fantasy lineups heading into week 9 of the season. And before we do so, let me remind you that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 9 NFL Pick'ems are already live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free NFL Pick'em for Week 9's action. And on top of that, all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH are also receiving a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL Pick'em for the week and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. All right, so let's kick the video off with the fact that we have a healthy Jordan Love going into week 9. Well, he is technically dealing with that groin injury, but he is expected to play here in week 9, not expected to be out this week in that matchup against the Detroit Lions. So this is a fantastic matchup for Jordan Love, as the Lions are giving up the 29th most fantasy points to the quarterback position so far on the season. I know Love was very disappointing last week, but he was playing hurt. I know it was a smash matchup last week as well, but if you own Jordan Love, I think you have to roll him out there here in week 9. Now, this is a home game for the Packers. This is not a domed game. And the weather report for this game does not look very promising, so we may want to take that into consideration. But for the most part, rain games don't scare me, but you have to ask yourself the question, are you kind of nervous going into this matchup if we're going to get a lot of rain and dreary weather throughout this matchup? But I actually, earlier in the week, I expected Jordan Love to make a push to play in this game. And the reason is because this is another big divisional matchup, similar to week 4 against the Vikings when Jordan Love pushed and played a lot earlier than some of us expected in week 4 against the Vikings. So even though that the Packers have this bye week in week 10, not surprised that Jordan Love is suiting up against the Lions here in week 9. Just don't forget, he has 18 or more fantasy points in 3 out of his last 4 full starts. We got all kinds of pass catchers on this team. We got a great running game with Josh Jacobs. If you own Jordan Love, he's good to go, and I think he's a great start here in week 9 at the quarterback position. All right, another player who's been absolutely balling out as of late, who is off of the injury report, is going to be Tryone Tracy of the New York Giants, who will go up against the Washington Commanders at home here in week 9. Tracy, 14 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 starts. Kind of had that bummer against Philadelphia in week 7, but the whole offense was awful in week 7, and the game script did not benefit the running back position. But we saw in week 8 against a good Pittsburgh Steelers run defense, Tracy just played some great smash mouth football. And I've seen a lot of questions throughout the week about Tryone Tracy, about potentially starting him, maybe being nervous coming off the concussion. We have to remember, generally speaking, a concussion is not an injury that impacts performance. It's not, a knee injury or a shoulder injury or something like that. Tracy's good to go. He has clear concussion protocol, and he has to be a start this week, even against a Washington Commanders defense that has been playing much better in the past couple weeks. But don't worry here. Devin Singletary just 2 touches in week 8. 5 touches in week 7. This is Tracy's backfield. And even though the Commanders have looked good overall, they still gave up a double-digit fantasy performance to DeAndre Swift last week. So Tracy, if you own him, he's good to go this week, and I think he needs to be in your starting lineups as we move into week 9. The next thing that you need to know is that it looks as if T. Higgins is going to miss week 9. Still dealing with that quad injury. He's listed as doubtful going into week 9 against the Las Vegas Raiders. So who's going to benefit here? Well, last week it was nobody at the wide receiver position. I mean, Jamar Chase still did his thing as expected, but we didn't see any of the other wide receivers step up. We didn't see Yoshi step up. We didn't see Jermaine Burton or Trenton Irwin step up. We saw Mike Gesicki step up, though, at the tight end position. 8 targets, 7 catches, 73 receiving yards, 12.3 fantasy points. So we look back on the season so far, right? Week 1, just a scratch ultimately when it came to the Bengals offense. So Gesicki didn't do much there. But week 2, with no T. Higgins, we saw Gesicki have 16.1 fantasy points. Then in Higgins' first game back, where he didn't get a ton of action in that game. He did have 6 targets, but we saw Gesicki's next best game, excluding this past week, at 8.7 fantasy points. So ultimately, for the most part, when T. Higgins doesn't play, Mike Gesicki becomes a viable streaming option at the tight end position. So if you need a tight end to stream this week, which, especially after this past weekend with National Tight End Day and almost every tight end balling out, you're probably feeling pretty confident at the position. But if you're not feeling confident at the position, you need somebody to plug in this week. Gesicki sits at 15% rostered at the time I'm recording this. He is a viable streaming option as long as T. Higgins is truly out here in week 9. Next thing that you need to know is that Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars is a true game time decision going into week 9, still dealing with that chest injury. I've gotten so many questions throughout the week about what to do with Brian Thomas Jr. And the answer is you just have to start him. You have to try and wait out. I know this is a later game today, but Brian Thomas Jr., your wide receiver 4 so far on the season, in a great matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, who are giving up the 25th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. I know this defense has looked pretty good in the past couple of weeks as well, but ultimately the secondary is still the weakest part of this defense, and Jamar Chase as a wide receiver 1 just absolutely balled out last week against this defense. And really, as we just went over, there were no other true threats in terms of receiving options for the Bengals last week, and right now, doesn't really look like there's going to be a lot of receiving threats for the Jaguars. I know we got Evan Ingram. Gabe Davis is questionable, maybe going to play through that shoulder injury. Christian Kirk is out for the season, and according to most rumors, he was going to be traded even if he was not out for the season, right? We got Parker Washington, who I think could do some things in this game and is a good pickup if Brian Thomas Jr. doesn't play, but with it being a later game, it's going to be really hard to gauge. Like, do I pick up Parker Washington last minute and plug him in the flex? Who are you going to play him over? You have to be pretty desperate to be in that situation. But Parker Washington does sit at 18% rostered if you're looking for a last-minute flyer. But ultimately, you have to try and hold out. Get your wide receiver 1 set. Get your wide receiver 2 set. And try and hold out for the flex position for Brian Thomas Jr., who's been absolutely fantastic on the season, averaging 15.5 fantasy points per game. He has 15 or more fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 starts. He's been absolutely great this season. No more Christian Kirk, even more targets for Brian Thomas Jr. Gabe Davis also banged up. If Pete Tom plays, you got to roll with him in week 9. All right, next thing that you need to know is that Drake Maye is going to get the start today for the New England Patriots as he has cleared concussion protocol, and there will be some implications overall for this offense from a fantasy perspective. But I do want to say, I don't think I love Drake Maye as a streaming option this week. He's certainly streamable, but this Tennessee Titans defense is just one of these defenses that hasn't given up a lot of fantasy points overall to quarterbacks, running backs, or wide receivers on the season. So they kind of are a little bit wishy-washy, but at the same time, they don't really allow a ton of upside to opposing offenses. And the Patriots on the road here, I think if you're struggling and you need to stream at the quarterback position, I'd rather start Joe Flacco. I'd rather start Bo Nix for sure. I'd take a shot on Jameis Winston. But Drake Maye is streamable. I just don't actually really like it a whole lot this week. So he's streamable if you need an option at quarterback. But what does this mean for everyone else? Well, I think with Ramondre Stevenson, who is coming off of a great game with 23.5 fantasy points this past week, we look at the 2 weeks where Drake Maye has been the starting quarterback. Well, Ramondre missed week 6 against Houston, and then in week 7 against Jacksonville in a great matchup, he had just 4.5 fantasy points. So for me, I think Ramondre's ceiling is higher when Jacoby Brissett's the starting quarterback. It's tough to say. On the road here against the Titans, who have been pretty solid against the running back position so far on the season, but they have moved back Couple spots here are now giving up the 21st most fantasy points to the running back position. So Ramondre's definitely still startable, but I think his ceiling could be a little bit lowered because the Patriots do like to throw the football more when Drake Maye is the starting quarterback. So yeah, we look at guys like Demario Douglas, Kayshon Boutte, Jalen Polk, who is cleared and off of the injury report. I mean, I guess there's some potential upside here, but the Titans are still giving up the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So what position are you in that you need to go out and stream a Patriots wide receiver? I'm not quite sure, but if you want to take a shot on one of those guys, I'm probably going back to Demario Douglas, but I think for the most part, let's just sit back and see what happens. Ramondre Stevenson still startable this week, maybe a little bit of a lower ceiling, but ultimately guys like Drake Maye, Demario Douglas, even Hunter Henry, I'm going to try and hold off, being that you probably have better options all around than needing to go out and start a New England Patriots player here in week 9. All right, sticking with that same matchup, let's take a look at Tony Pollard, who is now given some optimism to the fact that he may play this week, but he's barely practiced this week dealing with a foot injury, and that started to lead to a lot of speculation about my guy, Julius Chestnut, being a potential start in fantasy this week. Now, Chestnut has done next to nothing on the season. We talked about him in the last minute waiver wire video. He sits at just 6% rostered, and he is an okay last minute play if Tony Pollard does not play this week. But now reports are indicating that Tony Pollard should be able to play. So sit back and see what happens here. We'll probably know by the time that this video releases, but this is a smash matchup. Whether it's Chestnut, who you're picking up last second, if you're absolutely desperate, don't go starting Chestnut over, stud players in the flex or at RB2 or anything just because of the matchup. But if you are desperate, he is an option. And if it's Tony Pollard, this is just a smash matchup. Pollard was in the must-start video earlier in the week. The Patriots have just been awful against the run. The Titans at home are going to lean on that run game. So we'll see what happens here. It's good news if you're a Tony Pollard owner. It's bad news if you're in a position where you needed to go out and quote-unquote stream Julius Chestnut this week. But either way, the Titans running back should be in a very good position against the Patriots here in week 9. And speaking of running backs in very good positions, let's take a look at DeAndre Swift, who for me is one of my must-start players of the week, going up against the Arizona Cardinals, giving up the 29th most fantasy points. And you guys need to know that DeAndre Swift has a rushing touchdown in 4 straight games, 18.9 or more fantasy points in 4 straight games. Now he gets a smash matchup against the Arizona Cardinals, who just got absolutely torched by Devon Achane and Raheem Mostert this past week. So DeAndre Swift, we talked about him in the must-start video, and I'm just re-emphasizing, as I do every week on Sunday morning videos, 1 or 2 players that I think are absolute must-starts. DeAndre Swift is one of those guys. If you own DeAndre Swift, averaging 15.7 fantasy points per game, the RB16 so far on the season, you can't bench him against the Arizona Cardinals here in week 9. And I'm heading straight to Underdog to take the over on DeAndre Swift's total rushing yards, sitting at just 67.5 rushing yards. This line is an absolute lock for the week. He has smashed that line in the last 4 starts, and I love him to do it again here in week 9 against the Cardinals. So I would head straight to Underdog, take the over on Swift's rushing yards. And as I said at the beginning of the video, all new users who sign up with promo code The Catch are getting a free NFL Pick 'em for the week. Take your free Pick 'em, pair it with Swift's over on the rushing yards. Once those both hit, you're going to automatically triple your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code The Catch. Next player that I want to talk about is Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. And what you guys need to know, and this is coming from a true Zay Flowers stan, someone who has been all over Zay Flowers going into the season, has encouraged you guys to start Zay Flowers, trade for Zay Flowers throughout the week. I think you guys need to know that he might be a sit for me this week, going up against that Denver Broncos secondary, going up against Pat Surtain, Deontay Johnson on this team. I'm not necessarily too crazy worried about Deontay Johnson joining this team, especially in his first game, but something just feels like we could see a down day for Zay Flowers here, right? We know that we don't want to start wide receiver ones against Pat Surtain unless we're absolutely desperate. And we know outside of Pat Surtain that this secondary for the Broncos is very good overall. Now, I'm expecting a good game script here as the Ravens secondary is the exact opposite of the Broncos, and I'm expecting some points in this game, so the volume should definitely still be there for Zay Flowers. We look back at the past couple weeks, he's been fantastic. Week 7 against the Bucs is a wash because he was playing hurt. And then we had those 2 games, weeks 3 and 4, where the Ravens just did not need to throw the football, and outside of that, Zay Flowers has 11.1 or more fantasy points in every single game. And week 1, where he had 11.1 fantasy points, don't forget Lamar Jackson missed him wide open in the end zone at the end of that game. So really 18.5 or more fantasy points in 4 total starts this year, and then 11.1 in that 5th start. Then every other week we just went over as well. So Flowers has been great. He's a top 20 fantasy football wide receiver. But just tamper your expectations this week going into this matchup against the Broncos. If you have other options that you feel better about, that have better matchups, you may want to consider leaving Zay Flowers on the bench as we go into week 9. Once again, sticking with that same matchup, let's look at Courtland Sutton, who's going to be facing the Baltimore Ravens secondary that's giving up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position so far on the season. And I think Sutton is my other must start of the week here at the wide receiver position, coming off of a game where he had 17.12 fantasy points against the Carolina Panthers, 11 targets, 8 grabs, 100 receiving yards. I'm expecting another performance close to this against the Ravens, if not better. I think this is a matchup with more touchdown upside than we saw last week. Believe it or not, the Ravens are that much worse that they are a better matchup than the Carolina Panthers. So if you own Courtland Sutton, you got to get him in your starting lineup this week. He's a strong flex play. He's a great wide receiver to play. Whatever you got to do, Courtland Sutton, who I know has been a little bit up and down, but does have 15 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 5 starts, has to be in your starting lineup. Do not ignore this matchup against the Ravens secondary that's been playing like absolute garbage. And on top of that, they are very banged up, dealing with a lot of injuries. Don't ignore it. Courtland Sutton is a must-start player in week 9. And as a bonus, I'm just going to say, just like last week, where I told you guys to stream Bo Nix against the Carolina Panthers, where he had 29 fantasy points, Bo Nix, once again, is my favorite streaming option of the week. I like Joe Flacco a lot as well. He's got a fantastic matchup, and he's lower rostered overall. So, yes, let's give Flacco some flowers here. But Bo Nix, if he's out there, I'm in on Bo Nix this week. I was in last week. We've been talking up Bo Nix the past couple of weeks. He's the quarterback 10 in fantasy football, averaging 17.3 fantasy points per game. He has 21 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 starts. He's only thrown 1 interception since week 3 of the season. This is a smash matchup against the Ravens. I'm expecting points in this matchup. Let's cross our fingers here. But if you want some upside at the quarterback position, my bonus play of the week is go out and stream Bo Nix against the Ravens. And the last thing that you need to know is that Cade Otton has a fantastic matchup this week, okay? And I feel like the buzz and the hype around Cade Otton has kind of died down a little bit. Currently the tight end 8 so far on the season. He's at 18 or more fantasy points in his last 2 starts. He's had 7.4 or more fantasy points since week 3. I mean, and here we are going into week 9 against the Chiefs, who are giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the tight end position. And maybe it's just like a lot of people just have Cade Otton starting and they're just calling it a day. But you know, we went into week 8 and everyone's like, oh, we can flex Cade Otton. We can do this or that. We can start him over anybody. He's the best tight end in the world. And I mean, he basically was. He had 29 fantasy points, 10 targets, 9 grabs, 81 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. This is a better matchup here in week 9, and the Chiefs rank very highly, against opposing wide receivers, running backs, and quarterbacks, but they're really bad against the tight end position. So this is a fantastic spot for Cade Otton to be in. So all I want to say is if you own Cade Otton, he's a strong start this weekend. He's probably in that category here in week 9 where we can consider flexing Cade Otton as well. He's averaging 10.8 fantasy points per game. The ceiling's high here. There's touchdown upside here. If you own Cade Otton, he's a very strong start. Don't be too afraid of that Chiefs defense, because they're not so strong against the tight end position as we get into week 9's action. That'll do it for today's video. There are 10 things that you need to know as we move into week 9 of the fantasy football season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. Drop me a comment. I'll do my best to get every single comment on this video answered before Sunday's slate of games. And don't forget, guys, each and every week, we have everything that you could possibly need here on the channel to help you dominate each week of fantasy football. So most importantly, make sure you guys are subscribed to the channel so that you don't miss out on any of the content. With that, I'll say, thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and good luck in week 9. And don't forget, you saw it here on The Catch.